I want to thank everybody for their patience with this. We're still getting the flaws out of this system. My name is Myron Orfield, and I am a professor of law at the University of Minnesota Law School and the director of the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity. I am going to have the privilege of introducing Keith Ellison here today. In many ways, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison is the personification of the theme of this event. He's a great American leader in the effort to reunite the civil rights and labor movement and renew the push for racial and economic justice. Last year's summit examined recent trends in American electoral politics and the critical importance of Black voters and Black leadership in the last 4 years of national elections, and the implications for building a sustained multiracial movement for progress. We're trying to understand what we've learned since then and how does the recent outpouring of energy and anger around racial justice inform our thinking about political power and the opportunities to build Black-led multiracial power to change America. What have we learned from the nation's elections, the recent elections, about the role of race and racism and the Black electorate, including populist insurgencies on both the left and the right? What have the recent and unprecedented outpourings of anger and activism tell us about what opportunities are created for multiracial and Black-led leadership in building working class power to fight racial segregation, economic discrimination, and all the injustices that our society confronts? Yesterday, the president declared his intention to repeal important fair housing rules that many of the people that attended this conference worked on for many years. These rules were an effort after 50 years to begin to implement the promise of the Fair Housing Act. In doing so, he decided to build another wall, not a border with another country, but between communities in every metropolitan area of the United States. This is the first president who has decided to take on the very basis of the Fair Housing Act and explicitly endorse continued racial segregation. The president in his message talked a lot about low-income housing, but everyone in this room knows that the Obama rules were about much more. They were about freedom from mortgage lending discrimination and insurance discrimination, steering, block busting, and about protecting racially integrated communities from becoming resegregated. President Obama's rules were about the very notion of choice and allowing non-whites in America to live where they want, subject to the same rights and obligations as white Americans. As the president renews his call for segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, however, he faces a much different America than George Wallace did in 1968. In 1968, the suburbs were all white and minorities lived in the cities. Non-white Americans lived in the cities. Today, the suburbs are racially diverse. More than half of Black and Latinos choose to live in the suburbs, and 2/3 of African Americans and Latinos who have incomes above the median income. Almost half of suburbanites, white and Black and Latino, live in suburban communities that are racially diverse. Twice as many Americans as live in predominantly white suburban communities. These diverse suburban communities have twice as many congressmen and legislators as the majority white suburbs. These suburban communities lack protection from things like steering and mortgage lending discrimination. The Fair Housing Act protects them as much as it protects anyone in the United States. Yet yesterday, the president declared that non-white Americans have no right to live in any of these suburbs, that they should leave their communities and never come back. He declared that no matter how hard they try and no matter what they accomplish, they don't deserve to live in communities with whites. When the president seeks to repeal rules that carry out the Fair Housing Act, he not only builds a wall of segregation, but by withdrawing protection from steering and mortgage lending and block busting and insurance and banking discrimination, he threatens one of the largest parts of American suburbia. Without these protections, diverse suburbs will have a tendency to resegregate and be redlined in the same way that urban communities have been. This conference must work to unite the cities in the diverse suburbs and build and strengthen power between this large share of suburbia and the central cities in America. In this struggle and all the other struggles for reform we will discuss today and tomorrow, there lies the possibility of a new multiracial politics for civil and economic rights. We have an ability to show America that civil and economic rights are not just moral issues, but they are strong central political issues necessary to deal with America's present and future existence. In this struggle, we realize that Barack Obama, as a Black multiracial leader of America, is not a one-off, is not a coincidence, but he's a model for the future of American politics. This conference is filled with Black leaders who represent multiracial constituencies. And in many ways, they are the strongest advocates of civil rights and economic reform in America. These leaders deeply understand the harms of existing, unredressed illegal discrimination, and their political experience and savvy understands the intricate structure and potential power of a multiracial constituency. They understand America itself. Today, Keith Ellison stands at the very center of our nation's future. George Floyd died here, and his death brought massive demonstrations here and in over 200 cities throughout the nation. Today, Keith Ellison will tell us whether this moment, that has again revealed more than 50 years of unredressed racial and economic discrimination, will be a catalyst for reform of civil rights and economic rights, or will it be another moment like the moments surrounding the beating of Rodney King or Hurricane Katrina, or so many other police shootings that have occurred in the past? Will they represent a symbol of hope, a symbol of action, or will they result in another false acquiescence on our part to political powerlessness? It's my great privilege to give you our great Attorney General, Keith Ellison.
Well, a good morning, and Myron, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I want to say thank you very much to everybody assembled, all of the distinguished leaders, people who are new to the movement and are fired up and ready to bring real change, and people who have been around for a while, ready to continue bringing forth change and ready to give advice and counsel to our youngest members of this movement who are in the streets every day, bringing forth justice, freedom, accountability in this system. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you. Today, I want to talk about this civil rights moment, and I want to address the issue of solidarity and Black power. The fact is that this civil rights movement requires effective, concerted, unrelenting agitation in the street, in the courtroom, in the legislature, in the city councils, all driving toward justice, no looking back. It needs to be sustained, it needs to be persistent, it needs to be uncompromising on the issue of justice. And to do that, we have to have a proper understanding of what the moment is now and what is required of us to make maximum use of the moment that we're in. Let me just set the scene here. How do I go to the next one? I want to first of all start the conversation where it should start, right now. On this day that we are laying the great John Lewis to rest, only a few hours ago, really, we had a US senator say, quote, "We have to study the history of slavery and the impact on the development of our country because otherwise we can't understand our country. As founding fathers said, it was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built. But the fact is, there was nothing necessary about slavery. Anybody who says it was necessary is absolutely wrong. The dehumanization of literally millions of Americans for 250 years in slavery, and then another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation was not necessary. It was what was done because it privileged some, and those some who were privileged were happy to dehumanize others in order to get privileges for themselves. It wasn't necessary. And the justification to say it was necessary by Senator Cotton is even scarier, because there is a project called the 1619 Project where scholars are trying to help correct the historical record, and it is his effort to stop it. That's where we are right here, right now, and that sets us. Also this, let me talk about this one. Now this just came down the pipe, yesterday. President Trump says with universal mail in voting, not absentee voting, which is good, 2020 will be the most inaccurate, fraudulent election in history. it will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Now, here's the point I want you to focus on. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, safely vote. In other words, delay the election until he can win. He's talking about delaying the election. So we have a US senator openly arguing that it was necessary to dehumanize millions of Americans to benefit the slaveocracy. And we have the sitting president who says, delay the election because it doesn't look good for him now. This civil rights moment is a moment in which the United States can experience a brand new beginning, a new renaissance of true democracy that is inclusive of all, or it can experience authoritarianism, racialized authoritarianism. And it is essential that we grasp the moment so that we can make the most out of the moment, so that we can not just go back to how it was before COVID, before George Floyd, but bring ourselves to brand new heights that we've never really seen before, but which are within our grasp if we can answer this question: solidarity or Black power? The truth is, it's not or, it's and it's always been and. Black power and human solidarity go together because of one very simple, I believe, irrefutable fact. And that is that it is the suppression and the oppression of Black people in America from the very beginning that has allowed the people who control our society to divide our society and to weaken us all. Black empowerment, Black Lives Matter, Black power is necessary to bring up America's people to a point of parity and equality and equity so that we can come together and not be divided against each other, so that we can make a demand on a society for our mutual aid and benefit. But while Black people are kept in a state of suppression and oppression and exclusion and segregation, we are just easy to be exploited. It's easy to divide one against the other. It's easy to go to whites and say, those people who you don't know who live over there don't deserve anything because they're bad. You can promote stereotype, you can promote lies, but it's all based upon the disempowerment of Black people. Disempowerment of Black people allowed the election in Florida in the year 2000 to scrub the voting rolls in Florida of Black voters, so that that election, which George Bush lost, to go in his favor to the detriment of the entire country, so that he could push through a big pharma prescription drug bill, so that he can completely screw up the tragedy of 9/11 and not deal with it in a way that it really should have been dealt with, so that he could totally mess up Katrina and environmental regulation and cut taxes on the wealthiest and push the burden on to the rest of us. It was race and racism that allowed that to happen. We can talk about this more and more, but let me start with the moment that we're in. This is a picture of John Lewis getting beat by the Alabama State Troopers. This happened in March. By August of that year, because we were able to build the basis of a multiracial coalition, we put ourselves in a position where we could pass the Voting Rights Act. And understand this about the Voting Rights Act. White people benefited from the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act allowed people who were historically denied a say in their own governance to have a say, to send forward representatives like John Lewis, who would vote for health care for everybody, education for everybody, investment in the state for everybody, this Voting Rights Act, which John Lewis helped to pass, not only helped Black people long denied the opportunity to participate in American life, but it allowed representatives to go to Congress and other places so that those same representatives can pass legislation that benefited working class Americans. of all colors. John Lewis, right here, he says, I gave a little blood on that bridge in Selma, Alabama for the right to vote. I'm not going to stand by and let that Supreme Court take the right to vote away from us. But only a few short, but now, just a few short months ago, John Lewis's career is instructive for us because he, as an activist, just like the activists now, as a young activist, he was out there fighting for the right to vote, got beat down for it, and some people lost their lives. But now, as we lay him to rest, only a few years ago, his dream of everybody participating in the balance, hanging in the balance because of cases like Shelby County. The U.S. Supreme Court strikes down key part of the Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act in danger 1 year, Shelby County Supreme Court. Welcome to the first presidential election where the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. And then at the bottom, how Shelby County versus Holder broke America. That spans the life of John Lewis. John Lewis has gone on to his reward. The question for us today is, can we embrace Black power, Black Lives Matter, build that multiracial solidarity on the basis of equity and parity, and then work together to pass a true piece of legislation that allows all Americans to govern themselves. Let's talk about this issue. Power is key. Empowerment of Black people is key to everyone. Black power is not anywhere the same as white power, no matter what the races say. Because Black people are coming from a place of complete and total disempowerment. White power means more power to people who already have it. Black power means power to people who've never had it. Why is power important? If a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he's got the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Racism is a question not of attitude, but a question of power. You want to talk about power? Let's talk a little about power. Here's power.
Please don't come close to me. Please don't come close to me. Please don't come close to me. Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life. I'm sorry, I'm in Atlanta, and there's a man, African-American, who's a high school student. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I'm in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
Why do I say that's power? Because that lady knows that all she has to do is say he saw a Black man's doing something to her, and police will show up, and there's a fair chance that that man will be arrested, and there is actually an outside chance that he will be killed. It certainly would not be the first time that it ever happened. That is social power. Until we have a movement-wide ethic of Black Lives Matter, Black power, until we say nobody can simply have their life ended and their freedom taken away based on the say-so of some person, then we don't have a real movement. The destruction of white supremacy within the progressive movement and within America is essential to the freedom for us all. The truth is, we all know this woman here, she's not a Klans member, she's not a neo-Nazi, she's not a racist. She probably has Black friends, and she might have even dated a Black person at some point. Bottom line is, she knew that if some Black person annoyed her, she could rain hell down on them. And she's not the only one, and we all know it. If you doubt it, look at this. Negroes indicted on charges of rape. That's the Scottsboro boys. 3 Negroes lynched. That's the Duluth lynching. This is Donald Trump's, one of his early forays into politics. Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police, signed Donald Trump at the bottom. A man jailed for 3 years without a trial kills himself. That's the Browder case. Bottom line is, we know that this phenomenon of Black people being able to simply have their lives erased on whim of a white person is historic and it is modern. And we've got to have Black empowerment, Black Lives Matter, in order to create the solidarity we need to have a unified movement to make the change we need for all of us. 3 Negroes lynched in Duluth. And now, just a few weeks ago, because of the Voting Rights Act, because we have made some progress in fighting and beating down the hard metal of total racism, we were able to have African Americans be in positions of power to help grant a posthumous pardon. This is a product of our movement. It is what can happen, but the thing is, yes, we can pardon somebody who was murdered 100 years ago. Can we stop somebody being murdered today or tomorrow or the next week? That's the real question. We will see. Here's the thing to understand about solidarity, multiracial solidarity, and Black power. Fred Hampton said it best. We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight it with solidarity. Of course we need solidarity. Absolutely we need solidarity. But we cannot have total solidarity if African Americans unite with the rest of the working class at the bottom all over again. Let me give you a little sense of how bad things really are. When, there is no racial symmetry. There are no black and white mirror images of each other. There is a very unequal and clearly distinct difference. Racial wealth inequality is rampant in the US. White people who are in the blue upper line, they see their wealth above $100,000 in '83, $161,000 in 2010 almost. Whereas if you go down here, Black wealth, $68,000 in '83, Latino wealth, $4,000. Now, or in 2009, it was around 10,000, and it remains down there. I mean, when you think about this inequality in the racial wealth gap, you've got to ask yourself, what does that mean in terms of how much of a person's income goes to their rent? Or what does that mean in terms of home ownership? What does that mean in terms of education? What does that mean in terms of enriching after-school activities? What does that mean in terms of sports? What does that mean in terms of kids participating in other enriching activities that help build their educational background? What does that mean in terms of their healthcare? What does that mean in terms of who's insured and who's not? What it means in terms of who's insured, but they have insurance, it might be cheap, but it doesn't really cover anything. It means it has everything to do with a multitude of life indicators. Home ownership, more common among whites than other racial and ethnic groups. Oh, well, when you think about the history of redlining and restrictive covenants, that's not surprising. Blacks still more than twice as likely to be poor than whites are, no doubt. I mean, of course they do. Our country, Black people are not so much poor as they are impoverished. Northern cities have the greatest racial home ownership gaps. And then you have the president literally bragging about how he opposes low-income housing and how he's not going to try to affirmatively further fair housing, just yesterday. Why is he doing this? To exacerbate the isolation, separation, and segregation between the races, because he knows that if you're a white suburbanite who doesn't have any contact with Black people, it's a hell of a lot easier to vilify, demonize, and blame those Black people for the condition that they are in. Lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. Look at it for yourselves. All men, 1 in 9. White men, 1 in 17. I mean, the numbers are outrageous. For Black people, white people, the racial disparities in sentencing are dramatic and they are impoverishing. Anybody who has a loved one in prison knows that their income is gone to your household. You know then that the calls that they make to your house are expensive. Helping put money on their commissary books is very expensive. Even sending them money, they will charge you to send them. You have to pay to pay. to keep your loved one in soap and toothpaste if they are in prison. It is an impoverishing experience to have a loved one in prison. U.S. maternal death rate, look at that, just escalating right there. Now, what does it mean? That means Black women not getting health care. That means Black women not getting prenatal care. That means Black women being in food deserts. It means Black women being uninsured. It means oppression. If you want to improve healthcare outcomes for Black women, you will improve healthcare outcomes for everybody. So with that, I just wanted to tell you.
I must say to you, you have a role to play. You've been called. You've been chosen to play a role. You must play it so well, as Dr. King would say, that no one else could play it any better.
So I want to close on the immortal words of John Lewis. We need you to build racial solidarity by lifting up people who have been historically oppressed. That means the mantra of our movement must be Black Lives Matter, and it also must be racial solidarity for all. We need you to be a fierce fighter for healthcare for every person. I believe in Medicare for all, but whatever version you are in favor of, we need it. We need you to house everyone affordably. We need you to make sure that our economy, as it goes green equitably. We need to make sure that, yes, as we legalize marijuana, that the people who've been incarcerated for having it are now also benefiting economically for that. So at the end of the day, you all will come up with a very important set of prescriptions. But the most important thing right now is not your intellectual prowess. It's not your written plans. We have great scholars who can come up with all that. What we need you to do now is what John Lewis would have you do: make good trouble and go get in the way. God bless. Thank you.
I wanted to thank Attorney General Ellison for his eloquent opening remarks and passionate opening remarks. Now we're going to turn to our panel. And this panel, we'd like to have a conversation where everyone will talk for 2 or 3 minutes so we have some time for questions. I know that's a little bit of time, but I know you're capable of doing that and having a rich discussion afterwards. First, I want to turn to Davida Russell, who's a councilwoman in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and the president of the Northeast Ohio District of the Ohio Association of Public School Employees. Councilmember Russell, you are not only a powerful labor leader over a 10-county area, but you recently ran for and won an at-large council seat in a very diverse suburb of Cleveland, joining a growing number of African-American leaders in suburbs across the country. We have heard all about how important Black voters are, especially Black women in elections. When we look at a state like Ohio and its polarized politics, how important is it for leaders like you and leaders who look like you to break through in more towns, counties, and legislative districts that are diverse and even majority white?
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much for having me today. You know, pivotal and powerful are very strong and important words. And for me, powerful is staying true to myself and understanding that the only approval that I need is from God and my conscience, and speaking truth to power. You know, I learned at a very early age when my mother removed me from a high school that was predominantly, well, truly all African American, to go to a multiracial high school, because her thought pattern was I could not live with Blacks alone. I had to learn to live in a world where there was diversity. Where she was a part-time school bus driver for the developmental disability, and she dropped us off every morning in front of the school. Can you imagine what our thought process was at that time? It was racial diversity, but we were not wanted in that school. And we ran every single day home from school from racism. And at that early age, I learned that as a Black woman, when I enter a room, everything walks in that room with me, from the blackness of my skin, from the texture of my hair, to an underlying difference in intelligence, my temperament, my physical power and attributes, my sexuality, and even the stereotypes of the people in the room to what they perceive of Black people. And being a Black woman running for an election and being a leader of a large part of a union is very important because it's multicultural and diverse. But Black women's issues has not become a priority in politics. And for us to gain power, we have to have Black politicians, Black leaders, so that Black issues will not be tossed aside, that they will not be ignored, and that the true Black power life experience will come to life in legislation and policies across all levels of this community, as far as the state, local, and federal government.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fletcher, Bill Fletcher Jr., I want to ask you a question now. You're a labor leader and a political organizer who's thought a lot about the question of Black power in white-dominated institutions like labor, as well as populist and pro-worker political movements like the last two Sanders campaigns. What are we not seeing here, and what are we missing and losing out as a country by not being able to reconcile our economic populism with racial justice and Black political power?
Thank you for inviting me to be in this program, first of all. The question is an enormous one. So let me just, in the interest of time, take a couple of pieces. One is that when you're talking about populist movements, one of the problems is that with the important exception of the Rainbow Coalition in the 1980s under Jesse Jackson, most populist movements begin with the assumption or the myth of unity. In other words, they posit that the people, however they define the people, are in opposition to an elite. And while that may be true, what populism all too often ignores are the deep divisions that exist among the people. So it begins with this myth, and as opposed to recognizing that we are divided, and there's a particular reason for that, it tries to ignore that. And so you see in a number of campaigns that have emerged over time, this idea that we should all unite around a common economic program. And while there is truth to that, if that program doesn't specifically identify the way racist oppression operates, then what you have is a false unity, a false solidarity. And I think that that's one of the problems in many populist movements and in much of organized labor, which means that one of the critical things is that we've got to understand the historical foundation of race and racism and its link with the development of capitalism. This is not about getting people to like each other, to feel better about each other, to taste and love each other's food. This is about understanding how the larger powers that be have been very successful in creating a differential in treatment between racialized populations, African Americans, Native Americans, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Asians, etc., right? And so-called whites. And when I say so-called whites, because not all Europeans automatically become white, which is a whole other story. So the powers that be have been very successful in keeping people divided up in order to ensure that they, the powers that be, are able to continue to dominate. That is part of the lesson that needs to be integrated into every social movement. And so when we start talking about Black power, for example, in social movements like in organized labor, it's among other things, it's the power, the demonstrable power to influence change and not simply be a symbol. It's not just holding a position, it's the ability to be central to the all-round discussions of an organization or a movement. All the discussions about strategy, and not just dealing with the Negro question, not just dealing with race, right? But dealing with the totality of it. And that's when you'll start to see some Black power.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm now going to turn to the Rev James Woodall, who's the state president of the Georgia NAACP. Major Woodall, you are the youngest state conference leader in the history of the NAACP. You are not only leading the NAACP statewide, but you've run for office in a district that was far from a majority-minority district in the terms of the Voting Rights Act. Why did you do that? Do you see a path for yourself and other Black leaders for gaining more power at the state in the coming years? And why is that important? What is there to gain, and what, if anything, is there to lose?
So first, thank you for that question, and I'm grateful to be here, and to my distinguished colleagues on this panel, and to the Honorable Keith Ellison, good afternoon. One, I really don't know why I ran. See, quite honestly, I was a college student, and I was, quite frankly, tired of politicians coming into our communities asking for our support and then go into their legislative offices and do whatever it is that they want. I recall, then we were talking about guns on campus. I was a senator in the student government at Georgia Southern University, and we had taken a position, overwhelming 97% of our entire student body agreed to not have guns on campus. However, the state representative at the time, who still is currently in office, voted in favor of it. And so I said, well, if we're not going to have a representative that represents our voice, we must have someone else step up to the plate. And that's exactly what I did. I had done no data diving. I did not have a team. I didn't put together any analysis on my candidate. I just simply said there was an issue with representation, so I stepped up to the plate. That really started my political career. And I do believe, this is a moment where we can have a very honest conversation about leadership. But I don't know if the conversation needs to be started by what does it take to get power, but rather what are we actually looking to gain in this moment? For me, it's about the humanity of all people. And right now we have too many groups of people who are human beings who are being treated as less than human beings and therefore dehumanized and oppressed. And so the very first start, because we have Black people in power. I live here in the city of Atlanta now, and this is a majority African-American leadership community. And the fact still remains is that we have poverty, we have inaccess to healthcare and economic opportunity. We have, miseducation of the Negro, in the words of Carter G. Woodson. And so we really have to be honest about what it is that we're asking for, be very consistent in not only our ideological perspectives, but also how we really build the kind of movement that not only reflects what is the antithesis to oppression and dehumanization, but in fact, what does it mean to be human, and how do we make that happen in real life, in real time? So I think that's really where we are as a movement, and I'm willing to do what I can do to make that happen.
Thank you very much. We've got a few questions from the audience, and if there anyone else would like to send in questions, please do this. One of the questions, would you mind clarifying, and I direct this to each of the panelists, what does power mean? What does political power mean? And how do we think about creating multiracial political power? Maybe we can start with Attorney General Ellison.
Well, power means the ability to control your life. Power means that if you want to pursue your education, you can do that. Power means you can walk through the streets of your neighborhood and not be negatively impacted by law enforcement as long as you're not doing anything. It means that you can be treated fairly within the criminal justice system. It means that you will be protected by the instrumentality of the law. And it also means that you will not be persecuted by the instrumentality of the law. It means that you have the ability to, if you want to apply yourself to buy a home, you work hard and you get the money and you buy one. It's important to talk about what the absence of power is too. Because if you've always had power, it's like water. Does the fish notice the water? No. If you're a white person, you don't really feel what it means necessarily to be oppressed by police brutality. You might, I'm not saying never, but if you're a Black person, there is an ever-present sense that any time a flashing light is behind you, it can have a deadly consequence. So power is breathing free, living free, going to the doctor, telling the doctor that this hurts and getting proper treatment for that pain. That's what it is. What is the absence of power? The absence of power means that you can be sick as a dog and your only option is the emergency room. The absence of power is you show up to your kid's school, not only are the desks all broken, and if you're in a northern climate, the schools are freezing. If you're in a hot southern climate, the schools are cooking, and the teacher's got the TV on, and the school has 50 kids in the classroom. And they're not teaching anything that's going to help your child. I mean, these are the things. Powerlessness is living in a tent near the roadside. Powerlessness is living next to a plant spewing out cadmium, mercury, and lead, which you complaining about does almost nothing to change. So these are the dynamics of power. It's not a theoretical thing. It's a real thing. But in a segregated world, people on the upside of the segregation can't conceive of what the people on the other side are living through. And the people who are on the bottom side of the power dynamic, to them, that's their life. So to them, not being nervous when the police pull you over is an unthinkable thing as well. This is why I believe we need to have solidarity in our movements, because people have got to be able to share with each other what their lives are like so that we can build some empathy, some solidarity, some joint action, and true allyship. So that's my take on it.
Go ahead, Mr. Woodall. I think you're raising your hand. Would you like to answer that question too?
Most definitely. So my challenge, though, with the notion of power, and I'll go by defining, I think what General Ellison has just shared is what it means to be human, to be able to do those things. And what we've experienced is the absence of, to his point, the absence of power. But the challenge is if we have not actually dealt with the fact that there is oppression. So if I, as a Black man, or as we as Black people, get nothing but power so we can do these things, we have not addressed the actual elephant in the room, that there are still communities that are experiencing that reality. And so, though I do agree with him that, being able to do those things and being able to determine what you experience on a day-to-day basis as a community is important, I guess my position on the question of what power is a deconstruction and a destruction of all kinds of oppression, because in the absence of justice, regardless if it's impacting me or not, you still do not have power, because there's still somebody in the ethic of Ubuntu, there's still somebody being oppressed. And so if we're talking about racial solidarity, we're talking about building a movement that is actually able to articulate what the needs of human beings are, we have to address that. Say, for instance, we are able to get the kind of Black liberation that we're pushing for. The reality is there's still even oppression within the Black community that we have not addressed. We still have Black trans women. We still have Black women who are still experiencing the level of oppression that is reminiscent of a kind of dehumanizing culture. And so if we really want to have power, it has to be destroyed so that all people can be able to have equitable access to life and life more abundantly. That is the only way. And again, this isn't theoretical. We have to start from a framework of where we believe the world should be, and then how do we make that happen? There are very real, practical ways that we can equalize the playing field so that everybody has access to quote unquote power and access and life more abundantly. So I just wanted to offer that in addition to what he's shared.
Another question that's come up is the Trump administration has announced plans to suspend Obama's fair housing rule tomorrow. And they're arguing that integration is not part of the Fair Housing Act. It's just about discrimination against individuals. we shouldn't be planning integrated communities. Nobody cares about this anymore. It's a post-racial world. At the same time, we're seeing movements in the courts to say that charter schools should be able to operate in segregated conditions, and that segregated schools are the best way to deal with the disparities. Should we be giving up this battle about racial integration? You have a lot of times people on the left in the housing movement and the community housing movement agree with President Trump. People in the charter school movement a lot of times do too. They just think that integration isn't important anymore. What about this? Should we care about this? Should we fight about this? Or should we let go?
To whom are you addressing the question?
Mr. Ellison, maybe.
Now, let me tell you, abandoning a society where we're affirmatively furthering fair housing means that we are moving back to segregation. In my mind, segregation is isolation. And if you can create isolated communities, then you can literally do whatever you want to the people in those isolated communities, and nobody even cares because nobody really knows them except for through the television screen. You can it doesn't matter what the police do over there. It doesn't matter whether there's no true law enforcement there to protect people from domestic violence, fraud, official misconduct. It doesn't matter because we don't care what they do to each other over there. I mean, these communities affirmatively furthering fair housing means that people can live where they want to live. It means that if you want to look, if you're Black and you want to live in the Black community, you live there. If you want to live in a community where you might be able to, I don't know, live in an integrated community, access a certain kind of store and a certain kind of job, then you can do that too. But look, we live in America. We got 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, and about 50 plus years of anything else. What is that anything else? Well, that's redlining, that's denying, that's saying that people who are domestic workers or agricultural workers don't get the benefit of Social Security. That's all that. I mean, the bottom line is Black people are not so much in poverty as they are impoverished by the society that they live in. Affirmatively furthering fair housing means people can live, they can have a place to lay their head in safety and security and in good health. We know that if you want to close the test score gap between Black and white students, house those students well, you're going to make a big dent in that right there. You want to improve health outcomes for Black people? Make sure they're stably housed in this richest society of the world. And by the way, we're not talking about no charity right now, because you and I both know that if you stack up all of the subsidies that upper middle class homeowners get, they far dwarf the HUD budget in Washington, D.C. I was in Congress for 12 years. I can tell you the mortgage interest deduction alone is bigger than the HUD budget. So we ain't got no problem with giving money to upper middle class white people. We do it every day and all the time. We have a problem with making sure that the people who picked the cotton and hewed the wood that their grandkids and great grandkids have a shot at a good life. That's what offends us. That's what keeps members of Congress, like Mitch McConnell, up at night. The possibility that somebody who's been excluded might actually possibly one day be included. That's what upsets them. What I'm saying is we've got to fight for affirmatively furthering fair housing. We've got to fight for everybody getting health care access. We've got to fight for liberty and justice for all and never abandon it.
I think it's also a way just to keep us powerless, to keep us set into a category where they don't know what we're doing. So they don't have to listen to us. So they don't have to pay attention to us, to pigeonhole us into different areas of the state where that's the ghetto. We don't pay attention to those. We don't need to know what's going on over there. And I think that's a way of just keeping everybody powerless and separated. And so we have to fight for all of this. We definitely have to fight for this to make sure that we have equal justice
Mr.
for
Fletcher.
all of us.
Our battle was not for integration, it was for desegregation. Our battle was to tear down a system of racist suppression, the pre-apartheid that existed in the United States. And as Attorney General Ellison said, there is no going back. One of the things, and unfortunately, I even hear this among some Black folks who are almost nostalgic for Jim Crow, talking about, we had our own stores and we had our own schools, and it's like, well, danger, Will Robinson. Let's stop for a second and look at what actually was happening. Were all of these things equal in terms of resources? No. Were we talking about the same quality? No. We might have been talking about the same intent, but that is completely different. So there's no room for nostalgia about Jim Crow. It was a heinous system. The apartheid folks looked at it. Hitler used it. I mean, there's no going back. And so I think we have to understand that Trump is once again playing to his base. His base is really caught up with this fear of white genocide and of white replacement. It's this whole notion that it doesn't pay to be white anymore. And that's what we just gotta be very direct about. This is very dangerous, and there can be no room for concessions to this kind of orientation.
Mr. Woodall, you have any thoughts?
Most definitely. And I think, when we allow the individuals and entities that in many ways are responsible directly for the oppression and dehumanization of our people to define the rules of engagement. And what I mean by that is they've tried to almost always, even today, today with the election stuff and yesterday with conversations about rural suburbs and how Trump is trying to really put communities against one another. The fight is not against, for me at least, it is not against flesh and blood. So every time we define the fight by being elements of social construction, meaning race, which though is very real, is a social construction. And so I think every time we fight that fight, we fight a losing fight, because the fight is not against the flesh and blood, but rather it's against power. It's against systems of domination and oppression that are committed to regard, because the reality is there are just as many people who are not Black, who are just being oppressed and dehumanized and killed and murdered. But only thing we're talking about today is how do we make Black people better in position to create the kind of systematic change that is necessary. I'm all for that conversation. But what I don't want us to do is limit ourselves. If we're going to have a conversation about liberation, it has to be about liberation for all people. Because for me, Blackness is not an identity of who I am, but rather it's an element of how we became to be in this world. Because when I was created and God blew breath into the dirt, it was not a Black body, it was a living soul. And so for me, we have to be able to define the rules of engagement for ourselves. Because if we do not, I am afraid we will lose. Because again, this is not a new question. This is not a new issue. We've been fighting this fight, at least in this country, for nearly 400 years. But yet somehow, some way, we still have more people being murdered, still got people in isolation and in institutions of enslavement called prisons. We still have people who are in poverty. We still have people who are not able to have access to health care. And so for me, I'm like, what are we doing wrong? Or what can we do that's differently than what we've done before so that we can actually get to a place of parity, of equity, and of liberation? Because for me, it's not about preservation of Blackness. I'm just gonna be honest. It's not about preservation of Blackness. It's about the preservation of humanity, because that includes all people. And so I just wanted to really lift that up, because when we have conversations, and I'm very pro-Black, let's not conflate that at all. I love my Black people. I love my Black skin. But when we're talking about liberation, for me, liberation cannot equate to the preservation of Blackness, because Blackness without whiteness is nothing.
Thank you very much.
And so I encourage people to look in Victor Anderson's Ontological Blackness, to really challenge us to understand what Blackness is as a concept, as a construction, because without that, we're just having conversations about constructions that we did not create. And I'm very, very intentional about doing that.
What do some of the panelists, some of the questions have said, how do we begin to work together? How should we pick priorities? Where do we engage? Where do labor leaders, which many of you are, and civil rights leaders, which you all are, how do we begin to build a multiracial coalition, and how do we begin to build solidarity among labor and African Americans and Latinos and whites, and where do we start? Go ahead, Mr. Woodall.
I start with, it's a two-part answer for me. One is as organically as possible. Oftentimes when we talk about multiracial coalitions and diverse coalitions, people are always trying to really appease certain sects of community. Be yourself. Come to the table with your full authentic self, and don't be afraid to actually challenge systems and institutions at the heart. What we've experienced, especially here in Georgia, and specifically Atlanta, we've experienced people who are committed to acts of symbolic solidarity, but we're not actually committed to destroying and deconstructing racist institutions. And so if you are committed to the work of equity and truly liberation for all people, you have to be yourself. You have to be willing to challenge systems that sometimes you may even benefit from. We are literally done dying. And so what that means is every single element of racist implication, from statute to statutes to public policy to institutions, banks, schools, higher education, jobs, corporate, all down the line. You have to be committed all the way or none at all. And so it takes a little courage. It takes some good necessary trouble. But if you are committed to building that coalition, I guarantee you, one, you have to be yourself. You have to be authentic and organic, but most of all, you have to be committed to truly liberation, true liberation for all people.
You know what? I want to agree with you there. And that was part of my first statement when I talked about staying true to yourself and not apologizing. The only approval you need is your conscience and God's. And you have to enter a room, even though people are not going to like it all the time, but you have to speak up and you have to speak directly to what the problem is. And we can no longer be shy and timid and not be able to take on the fights that will help progress the African-American people, but all people. And women must do it more effectively than anyone. We are the growing population in the African-American population that is voting more. In 2018, 6% of the highest rate of turnout and voting, and our issues are not being addressed. And when I look at my race and gaining power and talking about multicultural areas, the new millenniums and the Gen X are talking about issues. They're not so much about Democrat and Republican. They're talking about police brutality. They're talking about economic justice. They're talking about things around those areas that are dear to our hearts. But also in the community of multicultural race, they are listening and they actually get it too. So with the baby boomers, it's getting to be less of us and more of the new norm of speaking out and protesting. And we have to learn how to speak to the issue of the people of America and not just look at them and think that we don't know what's going on or we don't have intelligence enough to know what's going on. We have to be direct, we have to be focused, and we have to be demanding in what our ask is. So I agree with that.
I think I just want to add.
Yeah, go right ahead.
No,
go ahead,
please, go
Bill.
ahead.
No, I'm listening to you.
Thank you. Real quick. To build multiracial coalitions, a critical mass of white working people are going to have to understand that it's in their interests to oppose racism. That this is not a moral question or moralistic question. This is a matter of self-interest, that to the extent that you have a system of racist oppression that continues, it disadvantages and undermines the ability of white working people to advance. We see this time and again. You look at differentials in terms of income in areas where racial discrimination has been the strongest, and white workers end up being lower than in places where there's higher levels of unionization and a greater social benefits. So to the extent that white workers continue to identify with the rich and the infamous, as opposed to with people that may not look like them, but are suffering not too differently from them, they will be subjugated. We won't have the kind of multiracial movement that we need. And so that's one of the central things that I would argue and have been arguing that the labor movement needs to take on. It's not about asking white people to feel sorry for us. It's about telling them, look in the damn mirror and understand what the system is doing to you.
So I think Bill is spot on. Let me build on that just a little bit. So look, our problem is that because of white supremacy, white people falsely believe that they are not allowed to have problems and so they don't speak about their own problems. But if you look at this study from a few years ago out of Princeton, white men over 50, non-college, have the worst morbidity and mortality numbers in the country. They are killing each other with handgun suicides. That they are. They're killing each other. They're killing themselves. They are dying from cirrhosis. They're dying from opioid addiction. And every time you loosen gun laws, white male suicide goes up. Have you ever seen it on the news? No. Now, if you want to talk about black dysfunction, oh, everybody wants to talk about that. Why are those black folks killing each other? Why do we have black on black crime? When are the black people going to stop being so crazy and messed up? Well, wait a minute. I think it's kind of something that white folks do to go into a school and shoot up everybody, right? I think it's kind of a thing. Why? I mean, this means sex crimes. A lot of white male dysfunction in that area. What I'm saying is that white supremacy prohibits us as a society from dealing with the problems of white people. Therefore, we don't ask ourselves, why do white male adolescents feel they need a gun to go shoot up the school? Why do white men over 50 who are not college have this problem with suicide? Why do we have why do we have so many problems? You know, why are so many of the police that end up shooting and killing people? Why are they so often white? The problem is this is a sociological, economic, psychological, medical issue that we don't address because we will not allow ourselves to entertain the idea that white people have problems too. I mean, here's the reality. There's a great book I would commend to anyone. It's called Dying of Whiteness. If you're a reader, write the name of this book down, Dying of Whiteness. It's about 3 case studies. One is if you compare Kentucky and Tennessee, Kentucky extended Medicaid expansion, Tennessee didn't. Why didn't Tennessee extend it? Well, they said, I don't want to have my taxes go to some welfare queen getting free health care. Race-based arguments to not extend Medicaid. Kentucky, they did it. The health outcomes between Kentucky and Tennessee are stark and growing ever since Obamacare came into effect. You look at Missouri. Anybody can get a gun. You can carry it anywhere you want. White male suicide goes up. Nobody even talks about it. Our fellow Americans are in a crisis when it comes to suicide by the hands of a gun at their own hand, and nobody is even stopping to say, well, let's do something about this. I mean, and if you take another case of just the whole administrative state, what does it mean to cut taxes? If you cut taxes, you might end up like Kansas, where they had to get rid of a whole school day. You think it's only black kids that missed a school day? Whole lot of white kids missed a school day. Same thing happened in Oklahoma. Whole lot of school day went from 5 days down to 4. You think it's only black kids who got hurt? My point is, as organizers, we don't identify the problems that people are having, and then engage them in a solution around their own problems. We allow the problems that are being experienced, yes, more by Black people and brown people, but also being experienced by all working class people. And we don't say, look, let's organize around this problem. We say, we allow the racialized myth. This issue of COVID, absolutely Black people are hit harder. A lot of white people getting COVID though, right? So what do? We allow the narrative that this is a Black disease or an old person disease, which allows these bunch of idiots in Southern, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, to act like, oh, you know, young white people are not at risk. They're dying in Florida hand over fist because of this man's absolute negligence and recklessness. But because we allow it to be a racialized argument, white people think, well, this doesn't apply to me, even those people are dying to their left and to their right. Their grandparents are dying, their kids are dying, people around them are dying and getting sick, but we've allowed this to be racialized. My thing is, we've got to organize beyond our comfort zone. You got to organize beyond your comfort zone. Look, I'm the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. If Minnesota has more than 5% Black people, I would be shocked. How did I get elected? Because I'm Black and I'm proud. Everybody knows that. But I don't let my circle of compassion be limited only to people who got my skin tone. We're talking about everybody. Everybody needs clean water. Everybody needs clean air. You know what? We commissioned, sorry for going on so long, I'm gonna stop right here. We commissioned, as Attorney General, first Black Attorney General, we said we're gonna study and have a task force on reducing deadly force encounters with police. Follow what I'm saying? We did a study on police brutality last year, 2019, before George Floyd. We found that a majority of the officer-involved killings were white people in greater Minnesota. Most of the people who are excluded from voting because they have a felony are white. Now, these issues are racialized, and yet they affect everybody. The real difference is that Black people know they're oppressed, accept the fact that they're oppressed, and therefore don't mind going to protest the fact that they're oppressed. Whereas if you're white, from what I've gathered, there's a degree of shame associated with being a victim of police brutality or having a felony. Whereas Black people say, I got a felony because I'm in an oppressive situation. White people say, oh, I'm such a loser, and they don't want to talk about it. What if we had a movement that said, you know what, everybody who has a felony and can't vote, we're for you. And we reached out to all of them, all. We know in Florida, Amendment 4 actually gonna help a lot of white folks. Am I right about that? Absolutely, I am right about that. But they don't speak up because of the shame associated. So let's be better organizers, and we can build a multiracial movement and have Black empowerment.
I got a question about the suburbs. You know, one of the things we talked about at the beginning of the panel is that more than half of non-white Americans, more than half of Black and Latino and Asian families live in the suburbs. And particularly if you look at Black and Latino families at or above the median, about 2/3 live in the suburbs. These are places, these racially diverse suburbs have twice the population as majority white suburbs. Do they present an opportunity when we're organizing and getting out the vote? Should we be thinking more about the suburbs? Should we be, in some of the parts of the country, these racially diverse suburbs are Democrat. In some parts of these country, these racially diverse suburbs are conservative or Republican. Should people be thinking about these suburbs as important places in the country? Are civil rights organizations and labor unions, are they engaged in the diversity that exists in America? Anybody like to take that one on? Mr. Woodall.
Definitely. I would argue that the most important, geographic area within the electoral space is not the suburbs, is not the metropolitan, but rather it's the rural communities. Here in Georgia, we're experiencing unprecedented rates of migration, if you will, closer to the metro communities, so suburbs, yes. But what I've experienced, at least in my organizing, is that one of the greatest spaces of political power, of economic power, of social power, of theological power, even military power is outside of the metropolitan communities. And so every time we've seen an engagement on these issues, almost always they tend to start in Atlanta. They didn't start on the outskirts of Atlanta. But I've seen the success, at least in my research, in my scholarship, as well as in my activism and organizing, is that if you leave that kind of perimeter, if you will, you actually go to the smaller towns where, you know, houses are 2-3 miles away apart from each other, where you have horrible reception, no broadband access, hospitals are 50 miles away, that is where the people actually are. The people who are able to go out into the streets and get things done, the people who are able to call 20, 30, 40 people and build a network so that you can be able to push policies that you're trying to get done. That is where the power actually is. And so I suggest that we reframe how we include those people, because I believe we do have power already. It's just we are not utilizing it correctly as a collective. And so I argue that, you know, the suburbs, yes, but that's an old narrative. I would suggest that we actually look at the rural communities and really build from there.
Well, I'm getting a warning that we're over our time and we need to wrap it up. But I'd like to thank this panel for a very enriching discussion about the possibilities of multiracial political power and Black leadership. As we've started the panel saying, there's a tremendous diversity in American suburbs, and there lies therein a possibility to build a progressive leadership, not only in the central cities, but in the suburbs, and as Mr. Woodall says, in the rural areas of the country as well. I think as we go through the rest of the discussion, we'll be thinking about legislatures and Congress and how, in a nonpartisan way, a more progressive political agenda that enhances civil rights and labor rights can move together. We've got a lot of discussion ongoing. We've got a lot of important panels. So I want to wrap this panel up, and we'll be moving after a break to our next panel that you have in the links before you. Thank you, all the panelists, and thank you, audience, for your good questions and your patience with our difficulties in technical proficiency. We'll be back soon.